Hey everybody, I'm Lloyd Auerbach, and welcome to another Ask Professor Paranormal. What's up, Lucas? Well, let's see what's up tonight. Welcome, and as I think some of you know, depending on who's actually here with us besides Lucas, this is a chance for you to ask me questions or just raise topics related to the paranormal, to parapsychology. You can even talk about chocolate if you want to. That's a whole different topic area. And we can talk about a lot of different things today. So feel free to jump in with something. Yes, thank you, Lucas. I am counter-programming the Grammys. That was not intentional at all. But I figure a lot of people like myself will go back and watch the replay on whatever the streaming service that's showing the replay. I think we're actually recording it as well. Hey, Paul, good to see you here as well. Anyway, I was just chatting with my producer, Graveyard Grog, about a Star Trek convention I went to last week, and I just got to this today. I went to a local comic book convention as well. That's my whole other area of a lot of interest, as you might tell by some of the items that are behind me here and there. Um, so anyway, first thing I'll start out with, which I usually talk about, are the courses that are starting. And starting tomorrow, which is Monday, February 3rd, there is a course called A Skeptical Approach to Parapsychology. That's from the Ryan Education Center. I'm co-teaching that with a skeptic by the name of Kenny Biddle. And hi, Chris. Good to see you here. It's an old friend of mine. That's good to have you here, Chris. So I'm teaching the skeptical approach tomorrow evening, and that's an 8-week class. And we really kind of go into critical thinking and how it applies to paranormal investigations and parapsychology research and all that fun stuff. And then on Tuesday night, I start teaching the field investigations class. So that's the first level of 2 levels of kind of investigations from the parapsychological history and methodologies that we use when we actually go out and do investigations. So that's starting on Tuesday, also an 8-week class. I have one more class coming up in March, which deals with the technology, the ghost busting equipment and stuff. And I'll talk more about that in a couple of weeks. But you're welcome to join the parapsychology classes from the Ryan Education Center. It's you can get into them either this week or next week. Usually we don't let people in after the second, certainly the third week sometime. We definitely don't let folks in. But you can take them for fun. You can take them for credit towards a certificate if you want to. Those who pass the short quizzes, take the class and pass the short quizzes for the investigations class, do get a certificate, an e-certificate from the Office of Paranormal Investigations. You become part of our OPI network as well. And it is credit towards either of the 2 certificate programs the Ryan Center offers relating to investigations as well. So those are kind of something that folks have asked for quite some time. We will have an OPI, an Office of Paranormal Investigations website up very soon, in fact. All right. So again, it's just w.ryanedu.com, .org, excuse me. Here we go. Also, and you might want to mark your calendars. I don't have a link for this because I don't know that I don't believe it's on the Ryan website yet. But I am going to be doing kind of a dialogue with John Kruth, who is the executive director of the Ryan Research Center. I'm president of the board of directors of the Ryan Research Center as well. And we're going to be talking about the Ryan Center and its long history. The Ryan Center is 90 years old today. It started out actually as the Duke University Parapsychology Laboratory in 1935, founded by William McDougall, J.B. Ryan, and Louisa Ryan. And it was renamed the Ryan Research Center, after a number of years outside of Duke. So in 1965, the Duke lab shut down because JB was retiring from Duke University. And they asked him to move it off campus since he was the one running it. And it became the Institute for Parapsychology. And then in the late 80s, after Ryan died, both Ryans died, they renamed it the Ryan Research Center. And of course, then we have the Ryan Education Center as well. So we're going to be talking about not only the history and all the cool stuff that's been done through the Ryan and the Duke Parapsychology Lab, but we'll also be talking, John and I will be talking a little more personally about what J.B. Ryan has meant to us, because I probably wouldn't have had a parapsychology club in my high school without a letter of support from J.B. Ryan. That was a big thing. So I want to talk about more of that later on. So that'll be a fun thing. That's going to be on Saturday, February 15th at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. Yes, it is going to be on Zoom, and I believe it's going to be I think it's free. I believe it's going to be free. Normally, our webinars are free, but we asked for a donation. That's pretty much it, because the Rhine Research Center is a nonprofit, total nonprofit organization. I don't have a link, like I said, for that event, but if you watch, go to, let's go ahead and do this, just simply rhine.org, which will take you to rhineonline.org. There will be an announcement on that particular website for the event coming up, probably by tomorrow or the next day. That should be up there. So I hope that folks can join us for that and kind of join in the celebration. This is the first event the Rhine will be doing this year, given it is the 90th anniversary. So we'll be doing some more online events throughout the year. And also there will be, for those, or if anybody here happens to be in North Carolina or in the vicinity, there will be events actually at the Rhine Research Center in Durham, North Carolina. Don't know that I'll be involved in any of those personally, except for probably something in November when I'm going to be on the East Coast in that area a little bit. Okay, so that's kind of the latest and greatest right now. For those of you who follow or want to know, I know, Paul, you ask about podcasts all the time that I do besides this. I've got a couple of new ones I'll be putting up in the next couple of days that just got released. That'll be up on my website, which is very, very simply lloydauerbach.com. So there's a media page, and there's tons of older interviews, and the new ones will be at the top of the list as it happens. It seems to be that there's been an upswing in either the number of shows or the number of the shows that have been out there just asking me to do these podcast interviews. So I'm doing a lot more out there. And if any of you really start listening to a lot of them, you'll hear me being asked almost always the exact same questions. Not that I supply them to them, but there are certain questions that people often ask me, which fortunately I haven't been asked those questions actually in this session in Ask Professor Paranormal. So anybody has any question, otherwise I have something else I can kind of bring up for you all. So I'll give it a moment to see if anybody's got anything and take a sip of my coffee. And I'm not seeing anything at this point. So I thought I'd mention, I've mentioned organizations in the past. And if you go to just the About This channel, you know, the intro to the channel, and look at the text, there are links out to a number of organizations that are out there. So, and I've talked about the organizations besides the Rhine Center. You know, there's the Forever Family Foundation, which I'm involved in. I'm a member of the Society for Psychical Research and a couple of others as well. All right, so Chris, Courageous Conversations. Go ahead and post. So when people transition, what's the rest of that question that you've got? So feel free just to drop that in there. All right. So while we're waiting for that question or some other question, so what I thought I'd just kind of mention today is some books for people who are just starting out. So, all right, let's look at the question Lucas has. Do you have an interesting or cool story behind any of the items in the background? Okay, that's a fair question. And you're only seeing a small portion of the items I have on various shelves. So let's see, cool stories. I'm trying to think if I have any cool stories about any of the items. The only thing I can say is I have very eclectic tastes. If you look above my left shoulder, you will see kind of a case up there. It's right above the tick. And that case actually has little bottles of liquor, almost all of which come from Tahiti. I went to the Tahitian Islands back in the late 80s and went to a liquor distillery and kind of brought that back. And the thing that you can't read is it says in emergency break glass. So that's one thing. Right below that is an action figure, which is of the Shadow, as in who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men, which is one of my favorite characters. And I can talk about a couple of the other things in a minute. Let's get to Chris's question. When people transition, does it matter how they die, if it's a natural foul play or suicide? It doesn't seem to matter. There's some interesting discussion that goes on with mediums and people who have actually committed suicide, and what the afterlife is like for some of them. And it seems that foul play, if somebody is traumatically or tragically killed in some way, whether it's foul play or an accident or some way, it is not the case that they naturally stick around. We don't hear from the mediums, communicating with the other side, that there's any sort of major difference other than perhaps they might feel like their life is cut short. There are cases or stories of apparitions people who have stuck around after being killed by someone, not necessarily an accident, but actual foul play, who have wanted justice more or less, or tried to present some information about that, like giving testimony and then just before they transition. And that's happened as well. That's come up as well. For suicide, there is a book by Pamela Ray Heath, which looks at suicide after death. And there are a couple other books that talk about that and look at the afterlife beliefs of a variety of cultures and religions, and then looking at what mediums have said. So I do recommend that book. Her last name is Heath, Heath, and it is about suicide in that case. But it doesn't seem to matter when people die in terms of how they transition or whether. It's really about how strongly they want to stick around or some other events that keep them here. But they typically tend to be more psychological. In other words, they're personal to the individual more than anything else out there. So if you have any follow-up questions, happy to answer those. All right, so I can talk about a couple of the other items. Probably can't tell very easily, but right over my right shoulder where that little ghosty is sitting on top of a Zoltar that actually speaks, next to the Marshmallow Man. There are 2 decks of tarot cards. I just wanted to mention those. I can just mention those. There's a Ghostbusters tarot card deck and a Star Trek The Next Generation tarot deck that's there. And straight up above, in fact, I can kind of pull this down. Let's grab this. So there's a website called Mini Museum, and they sell small relics, like pieces of relics and fossils and things like that. And this one is supposed to be soil from Dracula's castle, from the castle of Vlad Tepes. So I kind of thought that would be a fun thing to have around the house. Is there an item you would love to add to your collection? That's a really good question. I collect a lot of different things. I collect various tarot cards. I actually just saw a Kickstarter for a deck of tarot cards based with the artwork from Frank Frazetta, who's a well-known fantasy and science fiction artist. So I'm kind of hoping on that one. That'll be out in a few months, and I'll probably pick that one up. The one item that I want to add to my collection is something I'm on a wait list for, but there's a company that's producing sort of a working tricorder from the original series, Star Trek, the original series. And it's got little discs with data on them that you can put in, and it'll play on the little TV screen. If you watch the original series, Spock had this science tricorder that actually had a little TV screen. There's a whole bunch of stuff that is video that's going to play on that relates to the original series. It apparently is going to do some other things. It may actually have sensors in it. So that's something I'm going to be buying when it actually comes out, even though it's not necessarily going to be cheap. I've been adding to my collection. I have so many other things around. I'm not sure that there really is anything. I was even trying to think about that. Somebody asked about giving me a birthday gift recently, and I couldn't think of what else to get myself at that point. So it is what it is, you know. I always like to pick up some stuff related to the Haunted Mansion in Disney as well. All right. Am I familiar with the new documentary Beyond Physical Life? No, I don't. I'm not familiar with that one, Paul. I haven't seen that. In fact, I'm way behind in documentary watching as well. So I've got a lot to catch up on. Yeah, Graveyard Grog was friends with Frank. Yeah, it was very sad when he passed away. I knew Dave Stevens, who created The Rocketeer, and I've met a few others in that kind of realm of science fiction and fantasy art, and also some writers as well. I was good friends with a writer named Martin Caden, who wrote the book Cyborg, which became the $6 Million Man, and a few others as well over the years. Okay, Danya, good to see you here. Paul, you own a Ouija board years ago, like playing with it. Nothing paranormal ever happened. Honestly, that's pretty much the case. Almost nothing ever happens paranormally. And I have many Ouija boards in the house. Um, some are downstairs, in kind of in a shelf in the garage. I actually have a Ouija board I bought at a science fiction convention, which is a Doctor Who Ouija board. Basically, it's a spirit talking board with the TARDIS on it. That was a really cool item. I've gotten some others that have some beautiful artwork on them. I have a Bureau of Paranormal Research and Development Ouija board, which is, for those of you who don't know what that is, Hellboy. If you've seen the movie Hellboy or any of the movies Hellboy, comic book based. So I've got that. Do you use tarot cards beyond collecting them? Not so much. I collect them, but I use a different deck, which unfortunately is hard to find these days. And they're called Psy cards, PSY cards. You can actually order them. They're still out there. I think Amazon even has them. Instead of a deck of 78, it's a deck of 40 cards. And when I've occasionally done readings at parties, because I will do them at parties and such, I use these cards because they tend to be they're actually more based on the Jungian stuff, Jungian archetypes. So you have, if I can show you a few cards. First of all, there's a yes and a no card. So here's a yes card, which is kind of cool. They have things like the puzzle and the message, and they have peace. They do have some sort of negative cards in the sense that there's a destruction card. Let's see if I can find another good one here. There's, of course, a money card. And I'm losing them on the floor here. There's a fortune card. There's, let's see, where is my favorite? Oh, one of my favorite cards. There's a now card, and there's a never card, which has a raven on it, which of course it has a raven on it. So I have used these at parties, and what's really interesting is I don't do the typical readings, as a mentalist, I don't do the typical readings of tarot cards. I have the folks shuffle them, thinking of a question. I then spread them out face down. I have them moving their hands back and forth, and they pull the 3 cards when they feel like the card should be pulled. And I've done this a number of times, and 2 things seem to happen. The majority of people pull cards that directly answer their question. So without me even knowing the question, they will sit back and go, "Oh my God, that's addressing my questions directly." So that's pretty cool. And then I can help interpret it a little further once I know their question. So they're using their own ESP to find the right cards. And the other thing that happens is I've seen themes occurring at parties as well. I did one which was a retirement party for a woman working for a construction company. And with one exception, every single person pulled the tower card because it was a construction company. That was one of the cards that in the 3 cards, with the cards being shuffled again and again. So there was a little ESP going on. And the one exception was a teenage girl, the daughter of one of the people there, who came in very goth looking, and she pulled 3 of the negative cards: beast, destruction, and death, I think it was. And she thought that was the best reading she ever got. At another party for an advertising company, every single person pulled the beast card, and every single person, as they were getting that card, said, "That's my boss." And then the boss came over, he pulled the beast card, and he laughed, and he said, "Yeah, that's me." And I didn't have to prompt him at all. So when you let people actually find the cards themselves, whether it's tarot or otherwise, ESP can work, their own ESP, because we all know our own connections better. All right, going back to Graveyard Grog, Frank's daughter Danielle has some of his paintings. That's really cool. I mean, I love Frazetta art. I have a couple of pieces of prints of stuff up. I love Frazetta stuff, and the paintings are worth a lot. Paul, thank you. I have Since speaking of tarot cards, I have a deck of tarot cards you can find on Amazon. It is a Star Trek, the original series tarot deck. Every single one of the cards is based on a different Star Trek episode from the original series. And so if you know Star Trek really well, you can do readings immediately because the card represents a scene from the episode that connects to the meaning of tarot cards in general. Very kind of cool way of going about it. Danya asks, Danya, people ask me how to make spooky entities go away when one wakes them up. Oh, it looks like you retracted that. Okay. All right, so we'll skip that. Do I listen to radio show Coast to Coast? I do not. I have listened to it. I've been on Coast to Coast. You know, I have to say that Coast to Coast, like some of the other shows, have had people on who are a little bit far out, a little bit on the fringe, even of the fringe in many respects. And I don't think that there's a lot of critical thinking in that. You know, we approach things in parapsychology a little differently, of course, even in the ghost hunting community. And even the approach to demons and evil, you know, there are moral questions there, but the fact is that the whole idea of demons is mythological and religious and not necessarily connected to reality. Evil is is an interpretation, and people do evil things, but sometimes those people themselves are not downright demonic, so to speak. Then again, there are people who frankly are acting that way, including a lot of ghost hunters who yell and scream at the ghosts to do something. And then get upset when they get a growl on their EVPs, like, you know, the demon is in the house. Like, yeah, you guys were the demons first. So it's tough. I know that a friend of mine who used to have a show in New York that I did a long time ago, and he had another show on the UNX network until he passed away. I remember an incident where he had someone on who was talking about UFOs, and my friend Lee Spiegel was incredibly knowledgeable and heavily into the real study of potential UAPs, UFOs, and this guy was, at one point he said something about, and he was a pilot, but he said something about clouds and a certain shape actually hiding UFOs. And we know meteorologically why those clouds formed in that shape. There was no evidence of that whatsoever. I mean, there was a lot of stuff. So, and I've heard, even the times that I have listened to Coast, sometimes, let's face it, there's a lot of psychics out there who seem to have an agenda and put out their own experience, which is fine for them, but doesn't work for other people. So it's very, very different. We have to look at what's really going on as much as possible for that. Let's see. I'm not sure, Danya, I'm not sure what I should be addressing here in this particular piece as we deal with this. So I don't know that one wakes up spooky entities, you know, ghosts and stuff. Certainly mediums can connect with people on the other side, at least that's their stated mission, but those entities are not here. They're kind of, think of it as telepathically projecting from wherever, whenever, whatever they're in, whatever the dimension happens to be. So waking up spooky entities doesn't fall into my experience or anything we have in the field. I still have not had the time to watch the telepathy tapes. I know of the criticisms from one of the skeptics and the counter criticisms. In other words, the skeptic being criticized by one of my buddies, Brian Williams. The arguments against are really significantly ridiculous in most instances, but have been some questions that have to be asked of the researchers, and rightly so, of the controls that are placed on these things. But I do know Diane. I haven't talked to Diane in a while, but I do know Diane's work, and I know what's been going on with some of the autistic folks that she has worked with, and there's some legitimate data there, and legitimate experience. You know, autistics, depending on the type of autism they have and what's actually going on, it seems that they have an incredible inner life, but have limited capacity. Again, this is some autistics for communicating properly outwardly. And one of the things that Diane, I know, has noticed way back when working with them, that one in particular was that he was somehow picking up stuff from people around him. And we've heard that not just with autistics, it happens with other people as well, that people sometimes can pick up information from the people around them. I can just remember a particular situation where Montague Ullman, who was a luminary in our field, he wrote a book called Dream Telepathy with Stanley Krippner back in the 1970s. Psychiatrist, also parapsychologist and psychiatrist, and he worked at a psychiatric facility at one point where they had a lot of people diagnosed with schizophrenia, and some of those patients were freaking out the staff because the patients were hearing voices that would tell them things about the staff, like private things. So knowing parapsychology, one of the things he told me is that he examined these folks. He would take certain ones off of their meds and give them a technique, a visualization technique that is often used by psychics to block too much psychic information, to kind of turn it off. And only a few weeks later, generally, these people walked out of the institution, not needing any medication whatsoever at all. So his hypothesis was they were, if you want to say hearing voices, they were getting the information from kind of the surface thoughts, or just simply the information around the individuals around them, the staff, and they felt no compunction in blurting it out. So, and these are the voices in their heads. Once they put the psychic self-defense or psychic protection thing up, the visualization, the voices stopped because they weren't getting external information at all. All right, so PhD Angel, thoughts of Michael Shermer, not Sherman. Michael Sherman was somebody I went to school with. Sometimes Michael Shermer drives me nuts, sometimes not. I've met him. I've been on a couple TV shows with him. I've met him years ago as well. In general, I think he's certainly got a better approach, or slightly more open approach than most of the folks who call themselves a skeptic. But still, he will not examine. I mean, he has examined some of the research from, at least I don't know if he's done it recently, but he did. He asks good questions, but like many of the folks who are more on the disbelieving side, if it doesn't fit into their worldview, he may not acknowledge that the evidence is any good. But I do know that he's easier to talk to. He's had a few mystical experiences himself. From what I understand, he's had a couple of psychic experiences, or what we would consider a psychic experience, although he'll label them something else as well. There are folks who there are people who call themselves skeptics, and very often those people are not skeptics. We might call them disbelievers, cynics, debunkers sometimes. And I know that it bugs real skeptics when they see something written up by someone who calls himself a skeptic, and it will say in the article that they're writing, when they're denying the existence or the possibility of ESP, for example, and they're then saying, well, I never look at the data because why would I, since ESP is impossible. So in other words, they're saying ESP is impossible, so there's no amount of evidence that I should even look at because ESP is impossible. It's just a waste of my time. That's not skepticism. That's disbelief. I mean, Paul, Shermer has been affected by some of these things, which I think has made him more open, but still he's if we take the center line of true skepticism, and by the way, a true skeptic may never, ever make up their mind whether psychic things exist or not. They may just stay in the middle and ask a lot of questions. I'd rather see that than someone who just has decided there's no possibility of this. So there's a spectrum. Then again, at one end, you have the total disbelievers. At the other, you have the total true believers who believe everything New Age, paranormal, whatever is said, without questioning, even if it's in conflict. with someone else, something else that they believe. And I find that at both ends, it doesn't matter what you say. They have their idea of the way things work, their own worldview, and there's no point even discussing this with them, because if you take a so-called skeptic, what my late colleague Marcello Truzzi, who was a true skeptic, would call a pseudo-skeptic, who often call parapsychology pseudoscience. If you look at them and you look at some of them who have, like I said, written stuff up where they right up front say, I've not looked at the data, but why would I? That is not science. It's not scientific. And it's not skepticism in general. Lucas, you often find you're too woo-woo for the skeptics, but too skeptical for the woo-woo people. I'm probably the same. I haven't been called woo-woo by anybody but the amazing Randy, the late amazing Randy, as far as I know. Now, I don't know what people are saying behind my back. Kenny Biddle, who's co-teaching the class with me tomorrow, starting tomorrow, on skeptical approach to parapsychology, is more of a true skeptic. He's a little bit on the disbelieving side, but he's much closer to the center, I will say. And a lot of fun to talk to, actually. We get along very well. He has told me that, when he's gone to these skeptic conferences, because they occur, that he gets very embarrassed when a parapsychologist's name is mentioned. For example, maybe Russell Targ's name is mentioned and the original remote viewing project. And all of a sudden there's giggles in the audience and people chanting woo, 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 woo. And that's like, 5-year-olds. That's not it just really, it bugs me too. I mean, and frankly, if someone ever calls me woo to my face, I just have to laugh at them. Which, it doesn't bug me in that sense, but it just was so bizarre. I remember going to a conference that was held at Stanford University back in the mid-'80s, run by the Committee for Scientific Investigations of Claims of the Paranormal, the original skeptical organization. Now it's the Center for Inquiry. And they had, as one of the speakers, J. Allen Hynek, who was one of my professors at Northwestern. He was one of the leading experts on UFOs at the time. He was the astronomer consultant to Project Blue Book and started the Center for UFO Studies. And he was, in his discussion, in his presentation, he spoke about UFOs and how until we capture something, it's impossible. We don't know whether it's a nuts and bolts hardware, if there's something else going on there. And he talked about the fact that anyone in that world can't study UFOs because we don't have one to study. You can only study reports and photos and other evidence of UFOs. Just like we can't study consciousness directly because we don't know even where to start. So he did all that, and then there was kind of a Q&A, and the skeptics in the audience, many of whom were giggling and laughing as he was talking, kept on saying, things like, Professor Hynek, or how can you study UFOs? And Hynek would very calmly say, you can't study UFOs. You study UFO reports and the witnesses and that evidence. But this came up multiple times. Like different people asking how can you, just challenging him, how can you study UFOs with that? And that's either indicates that they are simply just not listening or they're not hearing a response that they really want to hear. I think what they wanted to hear is they don't exist. That's probably what they wanted to hear at that point. Okay. Did the CIA and KGB have projects on psychic powers or U.S. Army and remote viewing? Well, yeah. Do you know if any government has any military projects currently? I don't know the answer to that. Whether there are people in the military itself using remote viewing or something else is a different story, because you could have, individuals, kind of like in law enforcement. There's no project per se in law enforcement, but law enforcement people will occasionally consult with somebody who's psychic or one of the remote viewers. But the CIA and KGB really did have projects on this. You can read the book that I co-authored called ESP Wars East and West for a history of both the U.S. and Soviet/Russian programs on remote viewing and psychic abilities. The most recent name of that program for the U.S. was called Project Stargate, or Stargate Program. Two words typically, although it sometimes shows up as one. And the CIA was not the only organization involved. So it was not a CIA program per se. It was started with oversight by the CIA in 1972 by Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff and Ingo Swann, who was the psychic who was teaching people in the military to do this. The program also, the same researchers throughout the entire program, and it was different people running the program. Ed May took over. First it was Dale Graff in the mid-'80s, and then Ed May took over as director of the program. And they were doing research that was also published with folks that were not necessarily military personnel, or with tasks, in other words, questions or targets that were not military targets. But the CIA was the oversight initially and at the very end of the program. But in between, it bounced around with oversight from the Department of Defense and DARPA and a few other organizations. So it was not just CIA. The Russian programs, the Soviet programs, were in the purview of the KGB for the most part, the Russian military and KGB. After the KGB was gone, after the Soviet Union fell, it fell to some people who were ex-KGB, but still in the military. So like a General Alexei Savin and Boris Ratnikov and a few others. So there were actual programs, the US program, the skeptics will get up on arms that we spent any money on these programs. The total cost of the Stargate program from start to finish, 1972 to 1995, was a little over $22 million. Which was probably less than the Pentagon spent on toilets or anything else. In addition, if I recall correctly, I have to remember the exact count, I believe 21 government agencies would go to the remote viewers and task them with doing something for them. 17 of those organizations came back again and again and again. So 4 of them weren't as impressed. So it's as far as past the 1995 end of the program, Ed May has told me that he and Joe McMoneagle, and Joe was like one of the best viewers of the program, and he still does a little bit of research with Ed May, that Ed kind of likes to say that he and Joe haunted the halls of Congress and the Pentagon to try to get support after the program closed, for political reasons, by the way, mostly closed for political reasons in 1995. But they tried to get support, and they had support to some extent, but could never get the program back off the ground again within the government. And they really tried hard after 9/11. In fact, there was an attempt, because Ed had buy-in from the Russian remote viewers as well, because they were worried about terrorism at the time as well, to do a joint project, but they just couldn't get it going. So if anybody in the government's doing it, again, it's niche. There's not really that kind of full-blown program. There was another group of folks in the Army in the 1980s who Colonel John Alexander kind of started this up. They were called themselves the First Earth Battalion, or Earth's First Battalion, something like that. But it was a group of Army officers who wanted to learn to be real Jedi. So they took lessons from a martial artist who could do some psychic things, a guy named Guy Savelli. They did some other work as well, and eventually a book was written about their program, which was not a sanctioned program by the government, by the way. It was kind of a thing that they did, but the book was called The Men Who Stare at Goats, and you may have seen the movie. No relation whatsoever to the remote viewing program, by the way. Not an official project at that point. So that's a lot of kind of info dump on there. If you read ESP Wars, couple things I'll just mention about that. It is available on Amazon. So, and I highly recommend it if you're interested in this kind of thing, in the remote viewing stuff. Essentially, what could happen. What happened was there have been psychic spies in all sorts of cultures around the world going back hundreds of years. So we actually talk about the kind of history of psychic spying, then talk about the US portion, and then the Russian portion. In fact, our book, ESP Wars, is the only book on the remote viewing programs with contributions directly from the Russians, Alexei Savin, Boris Ratnikov, and others. So if you want to know a little bit of both sides, and you want to know how it worked with the KGB, that's a good book. And we left in some stories, some silly stories about the KGB, because Ratnikov and Savin were both KGB guys. And Ratnikov especially had some kind of funny, if you want to imagine there were funny stories about the KGB, yeah, there were some. So it was a really interesting book to work on, in fact. Lucas, I don't think Doge, yeah, would allow a program like that today. You never know. Elon Musk is, he is what he is. So considering how little the program would cost, even today, I don't know that that would be one they'd get rid of necessarily if it was providing information that Elon or others could use, for that matter. Lydia, finally able to catch one of these. I'm glad to have you here. It's good to see you. Thank you for coming. All right. Wonder what Doge will do all the Black Book projects. It's going to be really interesting to see what they actually get access to. As far as the Black Book stuff goes. That's going to be an interesting question. I'm considering there's a lot of people up in arms and what they're already getting access to that they shouldn't be. It's going to be interesting to see what happens here. Unfortunately, it'll be probably bad for some things and a lot of pushback. All right, Paul, you enjoyed the movie Men Who Stare at Goats. Yeah, that was you could only make a comedy about that in some respects. I thought that Clooney did a really good job too. And they wanted to be real life Jedi. I got to know Guy Savelli, who was one of the martial artists who worked with that group. I knew him before he started working in that group. He actually did some research with a number of my colleagues, including Bill Roll, and he came into the American Society for Psychical Research in the early 80s when I was working there. And we even had him out at JFK University in the parapsychology program a couple of years later doing a workshop. And Guy was a really interesting person, or is. He could do some really kind of cool stuff psychically. And I guess it was after he started working with, I think it was after he worked with John Alexander's group, he ended up training others in the Army to do some really interesting techniques. So I have a video that he sent me. Sadly, it's not the best quality because it's like 5th generation tape of what he taught some Army Rangers to do, which included taking blows and being able to be unaffected by them. So it was really kind of cool to see him whack this big Army Ranger. And Guy is a very big guy. He had a metal pipe and he whacked him on the chest, and the pipe bent around the guy's, not completely, but it bent onto the guy's chest, and whacked him on the back of the head with a 2x2 and a 2x4. And there were some other things that they actually did. So kind of really, really interesting stuff. Because, it's not about, even for Army personnel, it wasn't about necessarily just attacking or offense. It was also about defense too. There's some really interesting stories in Kung Fu traditions about being able to protect yourself against blows and even things like knives and such. But that's true is a whole different story. Yeah, Pete, it could be, this stuff could be buried in the black files. I don't know that Doge will ever have access to some of the stuff that, depending what the new head of intelligence wants to do, that's another problem we've got. What are your thoughts on researchers who claim a connection between UFOs and psychic phenomena? Well, a couple things. J. Allen Hynek was not, and actually Carl Jung, also going way back, wrote about this also, that Hynek was not positive that all UFO sightings were nuts and bolts hardware. Now, if they were caught on radar, the answer is probably yes, and that's the case today. But he felt that sometimes they might be psychic projections of some kind. We couldn't really necessarily eliminate that as a possibility, which would make it a psychic phenomenon in that case. But then so would a psychic projection of almost anything be psychic phenomena. Um, whether there is, there are some people who have UFO experiences or UAP experiences who do see an increase in their psychic ability. I don't see a direct connection unless they are psychic projections. Um, whether or not this is one of the many triggers that could trigger people's psychic abilities. Trauma or unusual experiences of almost any kind can trigger people's psychic abilities. That does not necessarily mean the UFO itself or whatever that is has any psychic qualities to it. So as far as Skinwalker Ranch, I don't know. I think there's a lot. First of all, because so much reality TV is involved, I have to say there's a lot of hype there. Anything with the reality TV has a lot of hype. It's just no question. And it may not be representing what's actually going on. That's also something I know from having done work with some of the shows and growing up in the TV industry myself. Paul, you've seen Lou Elizondo talk about UAPs and telekinesis. Yeah, again, is it the UAP that's actually doing the telekinesis? Somebody inside the UAP doing it? Or is it triggering something in the witness? Again, there are many triggers that have stress triggers psychokinesis. So I guess stress of seeing a UFO might do that too. All right. People in that world, I'm just not as caught up in it as I used to be back in college. But there is stuff flying around, and we don't know what it is. So it's concerning. It's interesting that it's actually been more out in the open. The concern has been more out in the open in the government in the last few years than it ever was. The denials that the government had for so long, according to people I know who were in military intelligence at one point and looked into it, the denials came from the fact that they didn't know what they were and they didn't want to let people know they didn't know what they were. So it was either denying that they existed or pretending like they had a secret. All right. Lydia, I remember one time you mentioned having an out-of-body experience where someone you knew. Yeah, that's right. So this is in my book, ESP Hauntings and Poltergeists. That's where I wrote it up. Because the event happened in the early 80s. It was when I was living back in New York and working at the American Society for Psychical Research. And I got to know very well Alex Tanis, who was our research participant. He was a psychic who did out-of-body work pretty much at will, and we were doing controlled experiments with him for that. I had barely had anything to do with the experiments, but I got to know Alex really well. Had him guest lecture some classes I was teaching, talked to him a lot about psychic development, about a lot of things, actually. And Alex kept on saying, that I would have, because I really hadn't had much of any psychic experiences at all. And he kept on saying that I would. And so one night, I remember waking up in the morning. I had been teaching adult ed courses, and I got to know a couple people in my class, one of the classes I was teaching. One of them was a psychic. She worked as a psychic, and I got to know her very well as a friend, and one of her daughters. So she had two daughters. One was 18, one was 22, I think it was. And I got to know the 18-year-old lived at home, so I got to know her pretty well too. And I woke up one morning remembering a dream that I had that I visited Danita and her daughter, Linnea, and it was in the middle of the night. The one thing I knew about them is that, so Danita never did any readings before, I think 2 o'clock in the afternoon, because she was truly a night person and would be up till 4 in the morning almost every night. And Linnea was pretty similar in that way. So they would also, I knew that they would stay up and watch movies late at night. So I thought that that's what the dream was about. Something that they had told me they would do that. So I get a call maybe 3 days later from Danita saying, "Were you ever going to call me?" And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "You were here." I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "You must have gone out of your body because you were definitely dreaming. And you showed up, us popped in the bedroom where we were watching TV, and we both saw you, and the dog saw you, and we had a conversation, and I told you to go back to your body." at that point. And then she described what I was wearing when I went to bed. And couple weeks later, I was at a bachelor party for a good friend of mine. We had gone out to dinner, gone out drinking. We were then back at his apartment, and they decided to watch some stag films, some porn. I get pretty bored by sitting around with a bunch of guys watching porn. So I went into the kitchen to pour myself a drink, and all of a sudden I felt myself split. It was a very weird sensation. I suddenly knew I was standing in the kitchen, but I was also standing in Danita's living room. She looks up from a book she's reading and says, "Okay, what is it now?" We have this conversation, and the last thing I said to her was, "Please write this down. Please take notes." So I felt myself back completely in my body. I found some paper, wrote down some notes about the conversation. The next day when I was at work at the ASPR, I picked up the phone. I called Danita just to say hi. I said, "Hi, Danita, just thought I'd check in with you." And the first thing out of her mouth was, "Did you take notes?" We compared notes. It was the same. Those are the only two out-of-body experiences I've ever had, by the way, at least that I remember. Maybe some others in my dreams. Okay, last couple things here. PhD Angel, my father-in-law was interviewed by Hynek and Valley as he saw a UFO in Chicago in the early 1980s. Thorough multi-section interview include dinner as well. That's good. And, Jacques Vallée and Hynek were like the men, the guys at that point in time. In the 70s especially, you would hear both their names. And Jacques Vallée was, of course, a model for one of the characters in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, that movie. And Hynek has a cameo at the very end of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which is interesting as well. What do you think caused the split when you had the out-of-body experience? I don't know what caused the dreams experience. I think it was Alex talking to me that I would have them. But I do know that I've had a lot of experiences over the years. Early on, nowadays it doesn't take this, but I would have psychic experiences of varying kinds when I was really bored. And I think that's what was going on that night. I was really bored. I've had other kinds of experiences over the years, but that was definitely a boredom-related experience. That happened to be my altered state that generated stuff. Have you tried practicing OBE again? I did for a while, and it's really interesting that every so often I have some kind of psychic experience, whether it's on a case or otherwise. It kind of keeps me triggered and involved in the field, like just reminding me that everybody's psychic. But I haven't really had the OBE experience since then. Certainly not one where I was perceived by someone at the other end. And no one's actually told me that they've seen me in that way. So I'm guessing I haven't traveled out of body. But while I was working at the ASPR, thanks to Alex, I had a really cool remote viewing experience. I had picked up things when I would occasionally go on a couple of investigations. I had some PK experiences, so some mind over matter experiences. With Guy Savelli, Guy had one of the things he was interestingly able to do was throw his chi, energy, across the room and break a photoelectric beam, so an electric eye beam. And he had me and Donna McCormick do it, or try to do it. He kind of walked us through it. And it was interesting that he found an emotional trigger for me to make it happen. So I was able to do it at one time. But really interestingly enough is something that, here's something for you can all think of this in a moment. Just let me just go back to this. If you've heard of projectology, I've heard of some version of that over the years. I don't know Waldo Vieira. There's a lot of parapsychologists now in Brazil, but that's a name I'm not familiar with. So I'm not familiar with that. Spirit can be in multiple places simultaneously. We haven't seen that case, that specifically, but obviously when we're alive, we can split in some way. Whether or not spirits can do that is another question I would have. But in any event, I think I lost what I was going to, my train of thought here. Oh yeah, I remember what I was going to mention here. So Guy Savelli had really kind of talked about how we unconsciously project stuff all the time. And he wanted to try a little experiment. The ASPR was on the Upper West Side, West 73rd Street, right off of Central Park West, on a very, very busy street. A lot of foot traffic as it happened. And we walked outside on this chilly day. It was not cold, that cold, but it's chilly. I had an overcoat on, and he wanted me to imagine myself with a machine gun under my coat, and that I would occasionally pull it out and start firing at people, which is a really weird thing to imagine. So we're walking along, and there's people in front of us, and he wants to start walking a little faster. And as we're walking faster, the people in front of us start parting as we get up there. And it was like almost an unconscious thing, like they knew we were behind them. And Guy pointed that out. He said, now stop thinking of that. And so we continue to walk, and nobody's parting in front of us. So either he was doing it, or I kind of felt like I was. And I've tried this before at other times as well. It's a really interesting experiment. Not that I want to shoot anybody, but when you project kind of like that split, you can sometimes influence people unconsciously to some extent. Okay, we're almost down to the wire here. Pale Wizard, I finished my bachelor's in psychology or special interest parapsychology. Continue. Okay, so next step, there is a new parapsychology program, master's program and PhD program as part of the psychology graduate studies at the California Institute for Life Sciences. It is relatively new. It only started, I think, this past month. Jeffrey Mishlove talks about it quite a bit. It's probably on his website or his YouTube channel, which is New Thinking Allowed, ALLOWED. But it's really, it's an interesting program. Again, it's a specialization in parapsychology. Jeffrey's overseeing it. He's a longtime parapsychologist. In fact, his PhD is from UC Berkeley in parapsychology, the one and only. So definitely worth checking out there. Okay, so we're down to the wire here. Just a reminder, which I started at the beginning of this, go to www.rhineedu.org to see the classes that are starting this week for the Rhine Research Center, online classes. I'm co-teaching one tomorrow night, starting tomorrow night, called The Skeptical Approach to Parapsychology, and teaching an investigations class starting on Tuesday night. And I'll have another class in March, a 4-week class in March. And also just a reminder that I do have a new website up. So go ahead and visit there. Take a look at what's there. It's kind of an author focus, but there's a lot. And I'm going to be blogging as well. So I've just got a topic that I'm going to work on this week. So I'm hoping to do some relatively regular blogs, which I've not done in a long time. Otherwise, thank you everybody for joining in. Tell your friends. Please like and subscribe. Pass along, folks. We'll be back in 2 weeks. So February 16th, same bat time, same bat channel. Good night.